Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Rahul's talk on Kotlin in the context of Android development. We are so excited to hear his talk on this. I'm personally very excited as an Android developer. I just wanted to thank Jennifer Ponder, who's currently serving as the front-end fellow, the mobile fellow, and the cloud fellow for helping us set this up. She's been amazing and has worked so hard and so much to keep us all on track. And then also to, of course, thank our sponsor, Bank of America, for the mobile track. And then, of course, Rahul for being here. A quick bio on Rahul. He is an Android developer at Facebook working on Portal, and then is also an adjunct lecturer at Stanford University where he teaches Android development in their computer science department. And in his spare time, besides those two jobs, he also has a really active YouTube channel where he teaches more people Android development. And I think you have the link for his Android development channel in your invite to this, so you can check that out later. Just a couple of slides about Women Who Code. Our mission is inspiring women to excel in technology careers. And our vision is a world where women are represented as technical executives, founders, venture capitalists, board members, and software engineers. We do also have a code of conduct for all of our events. And we are to just state that we are a very inclusive community, regardless of race, sexual orientation, gender, and language that you know. You can see our full code of conduct online. The mobile channel is, the mobile track has a really active mobile Slack if you'd like to join that. You can find the link here. We're always posting about Kotlin, Swift, some hybrids, and so we'd love for you to join that conversation. And with that, I want to turn it over to Rahul, and he can give his talk.
Awesome, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so hopefully you all can see my screen. Happy belated Mother's Day to the group yesterday. So it's a big deal for my family. My mom's birthday actually usually happens right on Mother's Day. But this year her birthday's today, and actually my wife's mom's birthday is on the same day. So it's definitely like a Mother's Day and mom's birthday combined thing. So hopefully you all had a good Mother's Day. So let me share my screen. Okay, so the way I'm thinking about doing this is I have a few slides, and I'm also going to be going back and forth between actual code where I show you some cool things about Kotlin, and I'll also be going back in between that and the slides. If you have any questions as I'm talking, I'd love to help answer anything. So I'm going to be leaning on Sierra. If there is anything in the Q&A or in the chat, definitely just put it in there, and then either you can raise your hand, or Sierra, you can just interrupt me anytime, and I'll answer them. Perfect. Okay. So what I'm hoping at the end of this hour that we have together, what I'm hoping is that you'll come away with a few different things. Number one, you'll have an understanding of what is Kotlin and why is it worth learning. What are the main benefits and features of Kotlin? And then near the end, we're going to actually talk about Kotlin in the context of Android, and we'll build out a simple Android app using Kotlin. So the way I want to go about doing this is I'm going to spend just a few minutes doing some intros, then talking about why Kotlin, the main features of Kotlin compared to a language like Java, which is essentially the predecessor, and then we'll end with the Android demo. I think Sierra did a really good job already of explaining my background, but I am an Android engineer at Facebook, and I work on a product called Portal, which is a hardware video calling device. And that's pretty interesting because the actual operating system of Portal is based off Android. And so one of the cool things about Android development, I'm sure many of you know this, is that Android is open source, right? And so one of the things about Android is that you're able to work on platforms beyond just building a mobile app. So you have Android Wear, Android Auto, Android TV, and then things like Facebook Portal. So like my job is because I'm an Android developer and I'm able to work on Portal. I also, beyond just my day job, I really, really love doing things like this. I love being able to talk about technology and programming and Android. So I've been teaching at Stanford. I'm actually teaching right now about class of about 30 students, which is really fun. And then beyond that, I think for the past about 7 or 8 months, I've been putting videos on YouTube, like Sierra mentioned, and that's a really good way I can reach a whole new audience beyond just 40 people or 30 people who I teach in a classroom. That's been something that's been really gratifying. I've also been involved with an organization called CodePath, which is a really cool nonprofit which teaches Android and iOS development at a bunch of universities around the country. So that's a bit about me. I'd also like to spend just a few minutes getting to know each of you who are attending. So we do have a poll, which hopefully you're all able to see. There are 2 questions on this poll. Which Hogwarts house would you be in? There are 4 Hogwarts houses in the world of Harry Potter. And then I also am just curious to know your background in terms of which programming languages have you worked with. So spend 30 seconds right now to answer the poll if you haven't already answered it. Yes, if you're not familiar with Harry Potter, then the way the magical world of Harry Potter works is that when you go to Hogwarts, which is the school, there are 4 houses, right? And each of these houses has a defining characteristic. So Gryffindor typically means you're really brave or loyal. Slytherin means that you're ambitious. Ravenclaw means you're very wise or clever. And Hufflepuff, some people say that Hufflepuff means that you have no defining characteristic. And other people say that Hufflepuff means that you're a very good friend. Okay, cool. So I don't know, Sierra or maybe Jennifer, are we able to end the poll and share the results with the group?
Sure, I can go ahead and end it now. Okay.
Okay, yes.
Okay,
Is everyone able to see the poll results? I'm able to see it. That's perfect. Thank you. So it looks like we have a lot of people in Gryffindor here. And then a few in Slytherin. That's great. It's a lot of ambition. And then no one in Hufflepuff. So the interesting thing is my wife tells me I'm in Hufflepuff. And pretty much all my friends tell me I'm in Hufflepuff. And I usually try and avoid Hufflepuff because I feel like Hufflepuff is the house where you go into if you don't fit anywhere else, you get kind of placed in Hufflepuff. So I always neglected that label, but I think I've come to accept that Hufflepuff just means that you're kind of a nice person, and I'll take it. So looks like there are no other Hufflepuffs here, but a lot of Gryffindor. Okay, good to know. Okay, in terms of which language have you worked with? So Kotlin, it looks like we already have about 5 people who have worked with Kotlin, which is great. So I think there might be some parts of this which you already know about, but I'm hoping to also show you a bunch of things that you are probably not familiar with. Java is a very mature language that it seems like a lot of people know. 10 people, 59% of people have already worked with Java. And then Swift and Objective-C, these are the languages for iOS development. And the reason I put them together is because the transition that the folks in the iOS world have done, where they went from older language, Objective-C, to something more modern like Swift, that's exactly the transition that's happening in the Android world, where we went from Java to something more like Kotlin. And if you're coming from a background in Swift, you'll actually find a lot of the terminology and syntax even between Swift and Kotlin are quite similar. So I wanted to kind of draw that parallel. And then C, C++, and Python are also pretty mature, older languages, and JavaScript is a language of the web. So we do have one person who has worked with JavaScript. Great, okay, so thank you for indulging me. It's always kind of helpful to know where are people coming from before attending this talk. Okay, so why Kotlin? Before we talk about the why and why I think it's the language that you should be learning, let's talk about what is Kotlin. So Kotlin is a programming language developed by JetBrains. JetBrains, if you're not familiar with it, is a company which builds developer tools. In particular, they build IDEs, or integrated development environments. So as a developer, you and I, we probably spend a bunch of our time in our code editor or our IDE. So JetBrains has made the IDE called IntelliJ, and that's actually the same editor which Android Studio is based off of. So if you're already an Android developer, you're already using the technology that's coming out of JetBrains. And so because JetBrains has so much familiarity and knowledge about developer tools, they also started developing a language, and that was Kotlin. So the Kotlin 1.0, which is a stable release, came out in 2016. So already you can tell it's a fairly modern language, right? It's less than 5 years old in terms of it being a stable language. Contrast that with Java. Java came out in 1995 by Sun Microsystems. So we're talking about a 2-decade gap between Java hitting 1.0 and Kotlin hitting 1.0. They're similar. Kotlin and Java are similar in that they're both statically typed, which means that every variable must have a type associated with it, something like a string, an int, a byte, a list, things like that. And they're also both object-oriented. So object-oriented basically means, we represent different constructs, different classes which hold state as objects. And that is a really nice way to model the world and model different programming abstractions. So the benefit of Kotlin is that because it came out more than 2 decades later, Kotlin was able to incorporate a lot of the lessons from the widespread use of Java, right? Java is an enormously popular language. It's used by literally hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of developers in the world. And so there's so much that we can learn from how has Java been written and used and maintained in all these years, and how can we use that to improve Kotlin or to invent Kotlin and make it a better language in some ways. And if you look at what I linked here, I'll share the slides at the end, but what I've linked here in the 1.0 release in 2016 is the blog post for Kotlin when they released it. And if you read it, they talk about how the top priority for Kotlin and the development of it going forward is pragmatism. And what that means is they're not trying to do something extremely fancy or elegant or invent the wheel again. The idea of Kotlin is that it's a tool, and the tool is allowing you to build things, right? And so the top priority that means is making Kotlin interoperate with the existing code and applications out there. And that's why one of the core tenets of Kotlin is that it interoperates with Java by running on the JVM. So both Kotlin and Java turn into something called bytecode. And that bytecode then gets turned into machine code, which will then be executed by your machine. But the fact that both Kotlin and Java work together means that all of the millions and millions of lines of code that are already written in Java, you can take that, keep maintaining it, but then for anything you build in the future, you can start using Kotlin. And that's a really powerful reason why Kotlin has gained so much adoption in these past few years. Okay, so that's a bit about what is Kotlin. Now let's talk about why Kotlin. And before we talk about the technical details of why I think Kotlin is really cool and impressive, ignore all that for a moment. I think one of the things about technology that here's my personal viewpoint, is that ignoring all the reasoning behind something, if you look at the smart people in your field or in your industry, and you look at what they're doing, that's usually a pretty good indication of a technology being really valuable or up and coming, right? So I used to work at Pinterest prior to working at Facebook. And what I noticed at Pinterest was that the smartest people on the Android team, they were working on side projects using Kotlin, not using Java. And so ignoring anything about the benefits or drawbacks of either language, the fact that these smart people are using Kotlin, that's a pretty good indication to me that I should probably be at least aware of this, right? And so I think the first takeaway for me is like, if you look at the community, there's a huge push right now toward Kotlin, and there's a reason for it, right? So Google I/O 2017, Google I/O is this huge developer conference that Google puts on every year. In 2017, they announced Kotlin support for Android. They went one step further last year. So at I/O 2019, last year, they announced that Android would be Kotlin first, which means that all the code samples and documentation would start by writing code in Kotlin, and then Java is still well supported, but Kotlin first, which is a pretty big sign of support by Google.
Rahul,
Beyond Google,
on this slide, we have a question of which Facebook products are currently using Kotlin.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say that in some ways, most or almost all of Facebook products are using Kotlin. But when I say using Kotlin, I'm not saying that like the whole app is written in Kotlin. The really cool thing about Kotlin is that you can introduce Kotlin slowly into a code base. So for example, like in the portal code base, which is what I'm most familiar with, a lot of our UI layer is written in Kotlin, but a lot of the kind of core Android components like services and the kind of MVC pattern that we use, those are still written in Java. But the cool thing about Kotlin is that pretty much everyone agrees, or most developers will prefer writing Kotlin. And so we're doing this slow migration to Kotlin because you don't want to kind of throw out your whole app and rebuild it. So I would say that the short answer is that most apps are using Kotlin in some capacity at Facebook. So that's a good point, right? Like, so Facebook is a huge company. The fact that, you know, we're using Kotlin is a pretty good sign, along with a whole host of other companies in the industry. The other thing is that Kotlin is not tied to Android, right? The fact is that Kotlin runs everywhere that Java runs, and Java is used for backend infrastructure projects, desktop applications, Android, and a lot of other projects, right? So anywhere that Java is used, Kotlin can be used, which means that learning Kotlin can benefit you even beyond mobile development. And then even if you're not interested at all in migrating your code to Kotlin, that's totally fine. That's a valid choice, right? I would argue that just knowing Kotlin will make you a better Java developer, or make you a better developer in general, right? Like the way I think about seniority as an engineer is having an opinion about different problems or different solutions, right? Like if you are able to come to a problem and say, okay, I know that in Objective-C, here's how you declare an array, and here's like the memory ramifications of doing something a certain way. Here's how Java does it. Here's how Kotlin does it. That's how you are able to really form an opinion and start talking about architecture, right? And so by learning a language like Kotlin, I really think that will make you a better developer in general, and in particular, a better Java developer, because Kotlin and Java are so linked. Okay, so now going down into the technical aspect, right? That was basically saying, look at what smart people are doing and follow what they're doing. That's what I do, right? I don't really know, I'm not the smartest person in the room usually. I usually don't have all the answers, but if I know someone who's smarter than me and does more research, they've done something, I usually can trust their opinion. So that's the previous slide. This slide, I'm actually talking about the reasons why Kotlin is gaining so much adoption. This is taken from the Kotlin website. There's like 4 kind of top level benefits of Kotlin. Number 1, it's concise, safe, interoperable, and tool friendly. Concise means that it's not as verbose as Java. Safe means that there are built-in nullability checks, which I'll show you later, which make it such that you don't have as many runtime exceptions in Kotlin. Interoperable means, like we talked about earlier, Kotlin runs everywhere that Java runs. They both run on the JVM. And tool friendly is going back to the idea that Kotlin is pragmatic, right? And what that means is a lot of teams have Maven or Gradle as their build system to take whatever Java source code they have and turn it into an actual app. So tool friendly means that all the work that people have done to configure their build system, pretty much all of that will apply directly into Kotlin. There's no need to throw out all of your tooling. And that makes the adoption of Kotlin really powerful. There's one more thing that I would add, which is for Android. For Android in particular, the Google team has developed something called Kotlin extensions, which make Android development even easier. So I think there's a whole host of reasons, like these are 5 good ones, why Kotlin will make your life as a developer much happier.
We currently have 2 questions that are kind of linked. First is, where should I start with Kotlin? And then also, at the university that you teach, are they using Kotlin or Java? Because this attendee is currently in school and they're using Java. Do you expect that to change?
Yeah, so I think, okay, for the second question, definitely I'm teaching in Kotlin, and I think it's partially because I have control over that, so I definitely prefer teaching in Kotlin. But even prior to me starting to teach at Stanford, the previous instructor for Android development taught in Kotlin as well. And I do expect that to be more and more the trend, because I think, especially at a university setting, I think that Kotlin is easier to learn because it's more concise and safe. So it's much, I think, a more beginner-friendly language. I do think that'll be the trend going forward. And then the first question, Sierra, sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, where should I start with Kotlin?
Yeah, okay. So I think my philosophy with programming languages is that the best way to learn is to build things. And so what I would recommend is you load up IntelliJ or whatever your favorite code editor is, and start writing code. So there's like the kotlinlang.org, which is the official Kotlin website, has a really good tutorial. So start by typing out the code that it goes in that tutorial and actually run it on your own in IntelliJ. That's how I would start with any language. Okay, so let me, before, I basically have like 3 or 4 different things that I want to highlight about Kotlin. Before we go into that, I want to show you a very high level example of what I mean but when I talk about the developer friendliness of Kotlin. I'm going to transition over to code. So are all of you able to see this? I have here IntelliJ, and I have a hello world, hello woman who code program. And so one of the first things you'll notice that there are no semicolons, right? So that's a good thing, no visual clutter. And you'll also notice that I have this green triangle next to this special function called function main. And function main is a special function or method in Kotlin, which means that we can actually execute this. And you'll also notice that this is not a function which is enclosed inside of a class. This is called a top level function. So in Kotlin, that's one of the nice things. You don't have to have everything inside of a class. You can have things in the top level. So if I run this right now, down here in my terminal, I should see a, let me see. Oh, I think my IntelliJ is freezing. Okay, well, here we go. So it's the font down here is a little bit harder to read, but do you see this? It says hello woman who code. So this is a very basic, hello world example. So what I wanted to show you is if I have a list, right? So the way you declare a variable in Kotlin is you say val my list is equal to list of, and then you can put in the whatever elements of the list you have. So let's say 42, 51, and 93, right? So I'm gonna kind of go through how you would do this in Java. So let's say my objective is, as I put on the slide, my objective is I want to retrieve the last element of this list, right? I want to get 93 back. So the way you would do this in Java is I would probably say my list, and I would use a .get method to get a particular element, and I would say, okay, I want to get the last element. So that means the index of that element is the size of the list minus 1. So I'll say my list dot size minus 1, right? Probably, I'm sure most of you have done this a bunch of times. So I'm going to take this now and turn it into idiomatic Kotlin code. And I think you'll be able to see the benefit of Kotlin by doing this. So first thing that you'll notice is that if I hover over this get, IntelliJ will start to hint at me what are some improvements I can make. So it says here, this should be replaced with indexing. So the better way to write this is you say my list, and you use this square bracket notation in order to access a list element. So these 2 lines of code are identical, which is pretty cool. Now, another improvement you can make is you can say my list, and I want to actually, what we're doing here is we're getting the last index of the list, which is the size minus 1, right? Because everything is 0 indexed in Kotlin, the same as in Java. The nice thing is that Kotlin has a way to do this in a cleaner way. You can say my list dot last index. That's even more clean, right? And you can go one step further, right? This is such a common pattern, right? It's it seems like something that essentially should be built into the language. So Kotlin did that for us. You can say my list dot last. And I can actually prove to you that this works. I'm going to put the output of this instead of a println, which just means printing it out to console. And this should print out 91. So I'm going to go back to the green triangle and run this again. And now in addition to the hello woman who code, I should also see 93 there. So basically you can see in these 4 lines of code how we went from something which looks like Java, and it's a bit more verbose, harder to really parse and understand immediately what happened, to something which is much cleaner. So this is kind of just what I'm showing here, because I want to share the slides. And so even if you don't have the code, I want you to be able to kind of see the transition. But so in general, I'm going to show a lot of code on the slides. But as you're doing this, one thing I'd really recommend is try not to just read code. It really, really helps to write code down. And I think the benefit of writing code down is that you have the IDE, IntelliJ, which will hint at you what improvements you can make. So for example, in that previous example, we said like my list.get, that can be improved by using the square bracket notation for indexing. So a lot of things like that, and autocomplete, you can only get if you actually type it into an editor, compared to if you read code, you don't get that feedback. Okay, so what I want to show now is basically 3 highlights of Kotlin before we go into the Android aspect of this. It's 11:25. Yeah, so I think we have plenty of time. Type inference is one, which basically means Kotlin can infer the type of something. Immutability means whether a variable can change value or not. And then null safety is another really important aspect, which we'll talk about. I've linked here the repository. So in this repository, if you want to actually see the code that we're going to write, it's all linked here. I can share this at the end. I'll share all the slides at the end along with these links. Okay, so first off is type inference. So first, let me show you Java, right? What you would typically do in Java is you'd say string first is equal to something. And then you have these primitive types, int age is equal to something. And you would declare a list like this, right? So compare that with Kotlin. The nice thing about Kotlin is that if the type is obvious from the declaration of the variable, you no longer need to declare the type. So for example, if I could say val first, this is kind of the Java equivalent. I could say val first is of type string and it's equal to Jane, right? But you'll notice right away that IntelliJ tells us the explicitly given type is redundant here, right? So you would never actually, in terms of style, you would never really actually indicate string here because it's completely obvious that the type of this variable is Jane, right? So the same thing can actually be applied for an int, right? So you can say val age is equal to 35. And there's no need to declare that age as an int because it's clear from the context. Where this doesn't work is if you have split the declaration of a variable and the assignment of a value, right? So for example, if you have a constructor of a class and that class takes in someone's last name, then you need to actually set it equal to string. And then later on, you can set the value of last to be Smith, right? That would be one valid reason why you would need to separate out the declaration of the type and the assignment. There's also a really
ask a question. I'm a newbie and I want to start with Kotlin as soon as possible. Is it hard?
Is Kotlin hard? No, I think that's one of the amazing things about Kotlin is that especially if you're coming from a background in Java, I think you'll be really, really impressed and happy with how easy it is to pick up Kotlin. And even if you're not coming from a background in Java, I think Kotlin is really, like a lot of the quirks of getting tripped up on syntax, a lot of that doesn't exist in Kotlin. So I think it really is not hard at all. And I'm also happy to, like even after today, if people get tripped up or have any questions, I'll leave my contact information. I'd love to help as much as possible to get folks up and running on Kotlin. So the other nice thing about Kotlin is how you declare lists. I think it's a much shorter and more readable way of doing that. You can say val friends is equal to, and you say list of, and you just pass in the elements in that list. So we kind of did this earlier, right, with line number 3. And the same thing applies, right? You could put in string here, right? And I could say friends is equal to April and John. But because the elements here are strings, it's clear that this is of type string, and I can get rid of the type parameter. So I'm that was a Java version. You can see it's a bit more redundant. Whereas here you can just say val age is equal to 35, and it's clear that's an int. Okay, immutability is another really important topic. What you'll notice is that over here in what we've done so far with type inference, everything here is a val. What val means is that this type is immutable, right? And so what that means is I cannot change the value of whatever is inside this variable. So for example, I can say age plus equal 1, right? What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to increment age by 1. So it was Jane's birthday. So now instead of her being 35, she is now 36, right? So what I'd like to do is increment her age, but you'll notice that IntelliJ is giving me this red underline, which says val cannot be reassigned. What that means is I need to change this to a var. And var is a special keyword in Kotlin, which means that the variable can actually have a different value over time. So age is something that is mutable, right? Changeable or mutable, which means that we have to make it a var, and that way we're able to increment it or decrement it or do whatever we want with it. So this is really important because the way I describe my job is actually as a manager of state. Okay, what I mean by that is as a programmer, as a developer, our job is to take whatever input is coming from the user, right? The user either tapped on a button, they entered in some text in the application, or maybe the input is the output of another application, right? Whatever it might be. we have this state in our program, and that state will be modified or maintained over time, and then we have some output, right? So programs have bugs when we're not able to manage that state properly, right? That's the key takeaway. And so the value of immutability, this concept of immutability that Kotlin has really taken as a first principle, is that you need to be very deliberate when you declare variables about what can change and what can't change. That's really why this is so important, right? So if you're going to make age something which can change, you have to declare it as a var. And if something won't change, like your first name is unlikely to ever change, right? That's why it makes sense to declare first name as a val and not a var.
Okay, we have 2 questions. First is a clarification. Please confirm whether I heard this right. If we have a continuous integration build that is already written in Java and we are converting part of this project to Kotlin, then we do not really need to rewrite our build system. The unit tests in Java will still be able to test our Kotlin code.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I would say for the most part, that is accurate. Like the idea of Kotlin is that whatever your build system is, like typically your build, like for example, like your build scripts itself may not be written in Java or Kotlin. It might be written in some other language like Scala or Groovy or whatnot. The idea is that those should run as is without modification. If you have a unit test, which is a functional test, like you're testing the output of something, that should also work totally fine without changes. If your unit test is actually calling into specific Java or Kotlin code and testing a particular like internal implementation, there are some changes you might have to make around being able to safely call into a Java method from Kotlin or Java into Kotlin. So there might be some things, but for the most part, the promise of Kotlin, and this is true as per the adoption of Facebook and others, is that it really should work without any change.
When applying for Android engineering positions, is it mandatory to have some experience in Kotlin? Currently, most of my projects are in Java.
Yeah, I would say it's not mandatory at all. I think the reason why I'm so bullish on Kotlin is that if all of you learn Kotlin, I think you're going to be ahead of the curve. So right now, I would say most companies are still using Java, but in the next 5 years, I guarantee that that trend will start to change. And even now, like if you're a startup and you're building a company, and you have the choice right now, if you don't have to deal with legacy code, and you have the choice now to build your app in either Kotlin or Java, I would say most companies would opt to build out their project in Kotlin because it's a much faster language. So that's what I do think you're going to be ahead of the curve if you start doing Kotlin, but I also don't think there's any downside into doing Java. Like if you're more familiar with Java and you think you'll interview better in Java, then definitely stick with Java, because I think what matters more is proficiency in your technology or in your language rather than trying to experiment with something that you may not be as familiar with.
And we got a third question while you're answering the other 2 questions.
Yeah,
do you have access to the QA? This one actually has a bit of code in it, and so it might be useful for you to actually look at it. But for everyone else, I don't know if they can see it. I was reviewing some code in Kotlin and got confused by the use of colons. And it's a sample of a data class with a sample of type any, and that extends a helper class. Can you read this code, and what is the importance of the colons?
Yeah, so the colon, well, I'll actually show you an example. A colon is actually just a general, it's a special character in Kotlin, which you can use to either to declare a type of something like we're doing here. And in methods, you also use it because in methods, for parameters of methods, you have to declare a type, right? There's no like default value or like implicit value. So you have to declare a type. So that's where the colon comes in. The T means it's a parameterized type. So this is a function. It looks like a data class sample, which takes in a type T, which is basically any type, like a string, an int, a character, anything, and it can operate on that. And then I think hopefully the colon will make more sense once I show you an example of a method. So if I haven't answered it at that point, just let me know and I can take another look. Good questions. Okay, so I have a question now for you. I talked about the importance of immutability. Hopefully I've convinced you about the importance of why it's important, why you need to think about as a developer what properties or attributes in your program can change and what cannot. And Kotlin makes you think about this with val and var. So I have a question now. If I want to change the contents of this list, right? I can say friends at index 0. Instead of my first friend being named April, it's now May, right? So I'm going to change my friend. So now my new friend is named May. But now you'll notice that this is complaining, right? And actually the reason it's complaining is I have to make this a mutable list. So I have to explicitly declare that the contents of this list can change. And now I'm able to properly change the value of this first friend to be May instead of April. So this is actually a bit confusing, right? I just told you that val means that the value cannot change of this variable, right? So like I had to change the age to be a var because I'm incrementing age. However, here I'm declaring this list of friends as a val, but the contents of it are mutable list. So it seems almost like a contradiction, right? So either I lied to you or there's some sort of way to reconcile these two. So can someone help me out? I don't know, like, can you all like raise your hand or maybe put it in the chat, whatever you're thinking. What is the explanation for why this is declared as a val friends, but it's also a mutable list? What do y'all think?
If you guys want to type your answers in the chat, then I can read it to Rahul. Maybe you can reassign friends, but not change the list.
Yeah, I think that's exactly on the right track, what Aditi is saying. You can't change which object friends is, but you can change some contents. Exactly, okay. I think, hopefully I'm saying the name correctly, Tane. I think that's exactly right. So basically, what you're saying is that there's a difference between the reference of an object and the contents of that object. And that's exactly the distinction I want to drive home here. And this can be confusing for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with referential programming, right? The idea is that I called this a mutable list, which means I can change the contents of the list. However, what I can't do, because this is a val, is I cannot reassign val to be another mutable list, right? Like this. Like that. And so now you can see, it's a mutable list of. Right, so now you can see this red underline. It says val cannot be reassigned, right? So this is valid, where I can change the contents of my list of friends because it's a mutable list, but I still, because of this val declaration, it still has a very precise meaning about val and var, which means I cannot reassign it. And so in order to make that a bit clearer, let me show you graphically what I'm doing. So here's, this is a Java comparison, right? In Java, there's no concept really of, there is a concept. The final keyword in Java means a value of a variable cannot be changed. But instead of the final keyword in Kotlin, that's built into the language. So you have to declare something as a val or a var. This is what I just showed. So here is the distinction, right? I have this list of friends, and it's pointing to some list. What we cannot do, because friends is a val, we cannot reassign it to another list. However, because the actual contents of this list are a mutable list, we're able to change elements in here. So exactly, I think a few people have said it now, but that's like the really key distinction that you should understand between the declaration of a list as a val and the contents of that list. Okay, the next big topic, the last one I want to show you before we go into the Android side of things, is nullability. So nullability is a really kind of weird thing in programming, right? Of an object being null essentially means that the object is empty, or it's like a placeholder value, right? And it's kind of a weird thing to wrap your head around. But if you look back at the history of programming, this person, Tony Hoare, who's a Turing Award winner, really famous person, in 1965, he invented the idea of null for a language he was developing called Algol. And he actually recently, he had a speech like 10, 15 years ago where he called nullability his billion-dollar mistake. And I think that actually vastly underestimates the damage caused by null. And when I say damage, what I mean by that is there's so many instances where, you're developing something, and for whatever reason, the object turns out to be null, which means that it's still the placeholder value, and you're trying to invoke a method on this null object. And of course, an empty object can't do anything, right? So if you have like a coffee maker object, if the coffee maker object is valid, you can actually have like a method on it, which is a coffee maker.makeCoffee. But if the coffee maker is null, that's going to crash your program. And that crashing of your program at runtime has caused billions and billions of dollars of economic damage. And so that's why Kotlin has taken that concept in Java and improved it a lot in Kotlin. So Kotlin adds null checks at compile time rather than runtime. Let me show you what I mean. In Java, if you're coming from that world, this code will look really familiar, right? You have string name, and I'm setting it equal to null immediately. And then I'm trying to compute the length of this null object, and that's going to crash, right? However, this crash is going to happen at runtime, right? So I'm able to compile my program happily. Everything works. As soon as I start execution of this method or of this static main function, this is going to cause a runtime crash. And that is a lot. Anytime you have a crash at runtime, as opposed to at build time or compile time, it's always more expensive, right? You want to be able to catch these issues earlier rather than when the user is actually playing with your app. So the way you would fix this in Java is you would say, if name is not equal to null, then you are able to know for sure that this name is valid, and you're able to call a length method on it. Compare that to Kotlin. So as soon as you declare a variable of type string and you set it equal to null, this is invalid. You won't even be able to compile your program. Instead, if you want to allow null values, you have to be deliberate about that. You have to explicitly mark the type of this as string question mark, which means it's a nullable string. And so now, if you were to call name.length, that would again cause a compiler error, because the compiler would notice, hey, this type is a nullable string. So there's actually a chance that you might cause a runtime exception, because this could be null, right? And that's a guarantee that the Kotlin compiler is making to make sure you don't have a null pointer exception. So the proper way to do this is you could use this question mark operator. And what that means is, if name is null, then I want you to not check the length method, because that would be invalid. And instead, I want you to go over to this operator, which is called the elvis operator, and return 0. If name is not null, then I'm able to call the .length method correctly, and I'm able to assign that back into length 1. The other way you could do this is similar to Java, where you could just do an explicit null check. And then inside of this if conditional, you are now able to call the method name.length, because we know that name is not null. Cool. So let me show you an example of this. So I'll comment this out because this is invalid, right? We can't do this for this immutability, for null safety. So I'm going to show you a method now, right? So I'm going to say like find compute. I'm just going to invent this kind of arbitrary method called compute friend score. I'm passing in the list of friends here. Okay, and what I want this compute friend score to do is I want it to go through the list of friends, and I want it to count how many letters are your friends. Like how many letters long are the list of all your friends. So in this example, it'd be like April is 5 letters and John is 4 letters, right? So I want the output of compute friend score to be 9, 5 plus 4. So I'm going to have IntelliJ help me create this function. And this is going to be a return type of int. Okay. So here's the thing. I want to be able to call compute friend score on both a list like this and also on a null object, right? For whatever reason, I might pass in null, and I want the output of that to then be 0. So here you can see immediately that Kotlin is complaining. It says null cannot be the value of a non-null type, which means that this parameter here is declared as a non-nullable mutable list. So in order to make this work, I have to add a question mark here, right? That means that I'm allowed to have null. And now if I actually try and say, okay, well, if friends, if I, for example, want to say, what is the length of friends, right? I could say friends dot size, right? And now, again, we're getting a complaint, which is saying that friends is a mutable property, which means that this might cause a runtime exception. It's invalid. If I try to run the program right now, let me show you. We'll get an error. Right, so you see this? Error on line 27, only safe or non-null asserted calls are allowed. So the way I would fix this, I would probably say, if friends is equal to null, then I know that nothing is valid. I'm going to return 0. On the other hand, if I've gotten past that if block, now I know for sure that friends is non-null. And then Kotlin also recognizes that, and I'm able to call this correctly. So in order to actually implement this, one way you could do this is I could declare a variable, which is called score, and that's equal to 0. And the reason I'm declaring this as 0 is because what I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate through this for loop, or I'm going to iterate through this list using a for loop, and I'm going to be modifying score. And that's why I'm making this a var and not a val. All right, make sense? So now I can do for friend in friends, I'm going to increment score by the length of that string. Right? It's a normal for loop, iterating over all the elements. So I can capture the return value of compute friend score like that. Val score. Ugh. And now I can print out the value of score. And the answer should be 9, right? That's what we had talked about earlier. It'd be like 5. Well, actually, sorry, it shouldn't be 5. It shouldn't be 9 because we're modifying friends here, right? So it'll actually be 3 plus 4. So what I expect is 7 here. Let's see if that actually works. Yeah, okay, so you can see the 7 down here. Amazing. And this is not part of really nullability. Well, hopefully that gives you a good sense of what does nullability mean and why it's so important. One thing I wanted to show you, which is not strictly related to nullability, but I think is a really cool feature of Kotlin, is functional programming. Right? So functional programming is really cool because the idea is that you can treat functions as first-class citizens, and you can actually use them as method parameters. So instead of having to do a for loop over the whole list of friends and having to declare this variable called score, there's another way to do this, which is one line. I can call friends.sumBy. This is a method defined in Kotlin where we're summing up some property of each of the elements in this list. So the way this works is you pass in a function. So the input is one element of the list, which is just a string, which is called friend. And the output is going to be an integer, and that's what we're going to be summing up. And so what I'll do is I'll just say friend.length. And let me prove to you that this is identical to what we had just written before, but I think, in my opinion, this is a bit cleaner, or a lot cleaner, and fewer lines of code. So I'm gonna run this again, and hopefully we should see 7 again. Yeah. Cool, okay. So
we have a question about, so in your method, is this how you would write it in Java? So I think that was before you changed it. Or how would you translate that to Java? How would you translate the method to Java? Only the method.
how would I translate? Okay, so I guess, I mean, there are some syntactic differences with Java, right? What I mean by that is, like, I think if you were to do this in Java, you'd probably have like a private int, like, and so in Java you have these primitive types, right? Like a lowercase int. In Kotlin, you don't have primitives. You have these objects which are wrappers around Java primitives. So you'd have private int, compute, friend, score. And then the way you would declare a parameter in Java is you would say like
List
string is equal friends, like that. And then you would have like the whatever body of the implementation, body of the method. So I don't know if that gets at the question that you're hinting at, but there are some syntactic differences. But in terms of the actual body of the method, it would be quite similar, except you would, of course, have to use like the Java syntax for like a for loop. Oh, thanks. Okay, so that's actually all I wanted to show in terms of the cool features of Kotlin. There's actually a lot more that I haven't talked about yet, such as data classes, extension functions, one-line expressions, things like that, which if we had more time, I would love to talk about. But, you know, Kotlin, honestly, you could have a whole course dedicated to Kotlin. And with 1 hour, there's simply not enough. And I also want to talk about Android, right? This talk is called Kotlin in the context of Android. So I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about the Android aspect, right? Any questions before we?
can you share your screen
Yeah.
from your IDE?
Oh yeah, from the IDE.
Take a screenshot of it.
Cool, yeah, like this one. Cool. Is that good?
Yep.
Okay. So quick background on Android. I'm sure many of you are aware of this already, right? So the Android is the most popular operating system in the world. Interestingly, it came out a year after the iPhone. So Steve Jobs famously went on stage in 2007, announced the iPhone to the world. Android came out a year later, but still, even though it came out a year later, it has multiple times an install base of iOS. So it is, I think, last I checked, there's almost 3 billion people, 3 billion monthly active people or users of Android, which is a huge, huge thing, right? Huge, huge, huge number. So if you look at Android 1.0, that came out in 2008. In 2014, they had Lollipop. So basically, the interesting thing about Android is that every year they would come out with a new version of Android, and it would be named after another dessert. And these desserts would increase alphabetically, right? So in 2014, they had Lollipop. The next one, what is after L? A, B, C, D, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M. And then it was Marshmallow. And then it was N. N was Nougat. And then it was O, which was Oreo. And then it was Pi. Pi was 2018. And then last year, they came out with Android 10. And everyone was wondering what would be the dessert, which is named after Q. And then unfortunately, Google decided to get rid of that system right as they came out with Q. And I think a lot of the people are guessing or hypothesizing that there simply are no good desserts with Q. And so Google did away with the system. I mean, I think people were talking about quiche, right? But I think quiche is not really a dessert. I would argue it's not a dessert. And I feel like quiche doesn't internationalize well. There's many parts of the world who don't even know what quiche is. And so starting in 2019, last year, with the release of Android 10, there is no more dessert naming system, which is pretty sad. But okay, so that's kind of a quick primer on Android. What I want to show in these last 10 minutes is this bigger number game, okay? So I'm going to open up now Android Studio. So basically the idea of this game is really simple. We have these text views at the top. These are called text views, which are basic labels, right? These are ways for you to present text to the screen, on the screen, but the user can't interact with these text views. But the idea of this game is that you have to press the button which contains the larger number. So in this example, 9 is bigger than 4. If you tap on 9, you would change the background of the screen to be green. If you got the answer incorrect, if you tapped on 4, you would change the background to be red. So this is a really good example, I think, of being able to take input from the user tapping on a button, and actually doing something as a result of it. And you can write this whole thing in Kotlin in about 50 lines of code. All right, so this is the program. I haven't written any actual code yet, except for I created the layout for us. Okay, so let me give you a quick walkthrough. So main activity, an activity in Android, you can think of it like a screen. So what I did here is I created an empty activity project in Android, which created a main activity, which is empty, and it has this line called set content view. So the layout or the UI that you're going to see in our application, let me show it to you right now. I built this out. It took me like 5 minutes. I'm sure all of you could do it. It's not that interesting, which is why I don't want to show it here. But I built this out, and the layout is defined inside of this file, r.layout.activityMain. So what you can do is you can control click on a PC or command click on a Mac, and that will jump to the definition of this file called activity_main. The layouts in Android are defined in XML. And so what you can see here, that this is a constraint layout, which is a special kind of layout to constrain views to each other and position them accordingly. You can see it's exactly like the screenshot that I showed you on the slide. So you have 2 text views at the top and then 2 buttons. That's it. So what I want to do now is I want to code with you the actual logic for the game. The business logic for an Android app lives inside of this Kotlin file. This is mainactivity.kotlin. This is where we're going to write all the code. Cool. So the way you reference a view, so the first thing I want to do with you is I would like to get notified when the user has tapped on a button. The way you do that is that each of these views on the screen has a corresponding ID. So if I tap on the button here, you can see there's this like attributes pane that pops up, and I gave this button an ID of button left. And by the way, what you're seeing here on the right side of the screen is a design representation of our layout, which has a one-to-one correspondence with what you're seeing on the left side, which is an XML representation of the layout. So you can see like here's a button in XML, and that corresponds to this button over here. So I call this ID this button with an ID of button left, and we'll use that ID to reference it in our Kotlin code. So I'll say button left. And what I want to do, so this is basically now a variable representing that button, and it has a type of button. So I can call all the normal methods on this button. So I can say set on click listener, and I can execute code here. So what this is actually doing behind the scenes, this is like a really nice feature of Kotlin. Whatever is inside of these curly braces is actually an anonymous Lambda function. And this Lambda function will get executed when this event is happening. Does that make sense? So let me prove that to you. So I can just put like a log statement here. Button left clicked. Right, so a log statement is, you can kind of think of it similar to a print line in our older code. You have to have a tag, which is a way you can kind of delineate different logs, and then you can have a message here, right? So if I run this, and if I tap on the left button, I should hopefully, inside of this log panel, I should see a log statement for the button left is clicked. Yeah, do you see that? So button left is clicked. And of course, if I tap on the right button, nothing happens. But the left button, I do get to see a log statement. So the objective is when I tap on the left button, I want to compare the value of the number in the left button and compare that to the number in the right button. And based on that, change the background color accordingly. Right? So that's actually pretty straightforward. The way you can retrieve the value out of the button is by, again, calling an attribute on the button left and button right. So I'll say button left dot text. That means get the text value out of it, convert that to a string. And in reality, we want to compare numbers, right? So I have to convert this into an integer. And this is going to be the left num, right? And now I can do the same thing now for the right num. So notice that this is called right num. So notice that I didn't declare a variable ahead of time for the right button. Kotlin is doing all the work for me of associating this ID, this button right ID, to the right button on the screen. And so now what I can do is I can say if the left num is bigger than the right num, then that means that user answered correctly, right? Because they tapped on the left button, and the left button was indeed larger than the right button. So the user answered correctly. And in the else block, that means they answered it incorrectly. So what I want to do here is I want to change the background color to be green. And here I want to change the background color to be red. The way you can do that is you need to get access to the background, right? The background is the root element, which is the background view. That's what I give it an ID of background view here, right? Do you see that? So I can say background view dot set background color. And then I can say color dot green if they got it correct. Otherwise, they got it incorrect. I can say color dot red. That's it. That is the whole logic for tapping on the left button. Let's try it out. If I run the app, we'll give it a few seconds to reboot the app. If I tap on the left button, so this should be correct, right? 5 is larger than 3. Awesome. You can see I did change the color to be green. I mean, the game's not very interesting right now, right? Because once I play the game once, the numbers don't change. What I really would like to do is I'd like to change the values of the numbers on the buttons. And so what I can do is right after I answer a question, I can say, I can have a method here called assign numbers to buttons. I'm going to define this function, right? And then what this is going to do is use the random utility in Kotlin to generate a random number. So I'll say val r is equal to random. Then r.nextInt. And then nextInt takes in a parameter, which is the bound. So I want to pick a random number between 1 and 10. And this is going to be val num1. I can say val num2 is equal to num1, right? So initially I'm going to set the left button and the right button to be identical. And then what I'm going to do is say while num1 is equal to num2, I'm going to reassign num2, right? So I'm going to re-roll num2 until they're different. And because I'm changing the value of num2, I have to make this into a var. So once I'm at the end of this while loop, I'm guaranteed that num1 and num2 will be different. Right, so the only reason I'm doing this while loop is I want to make sure that num1 and num2 are different. And now what I can do is I can say button left dot text is equal to num1, and then the same thing for button right. So the button right should be num2. And this $sign is basically string interpolation, which is another really cool feature of Kotlin. Basically, rather than having to convert something to a toString method, you can just put it in quotation marks and add in this $sign, and it'll automatically turn into a string. So let me run this, and then I think we'll be done. There's still one more thing that you should probably do with adding a click listener on the right button, but I'm sure all of you could figure that out. Let me just run this, and let's see if this works. Okay, so 5 is larger than 3, should be correct. So the color should change to green. And also the numbers on these buttons should change. Awesome, do you see that? So as I keep tapping, I get random numbers. The game's not super, it's hard to win this game because I can only tap on the left button right now. There's no click listener on the right button, right? So I'll leave that as an exercise for all of you. I know we're at time, but this is all I had. Let me go back to my slides. Here are some other features of Kotlin that we don't have time to talk about. But yeah, that's all I had in terms of the main content. I really had a lot of fun. I love doing this kind of stuff. If you have any questions about Kotlin or just anything in general, reach out to me. I'd love to help as much as I can. Here's some contact information. And I'll stick around for as long as needed to answer any questions. But yeah, thank you.
We had one question. First, let me switch it over to Jennifer to get some updates about Women Who Code. And then we can come back to some QA for anyone who wants to stick around for a few minutes.
Well, awesome. Thank you all for attending today. Thank you, Rahul. Great presentation today. Thank you so much for your time. So I just want to step in and give some updates. Right now, we are working on the Women Who Code digital event. So as you all may know, and you may be familiar with the Women Who Code Connect conference that has happened in the past. Well, with all that's going on now and everybody from home and how events are moving forward, this year, the Women Who Code Connect conference will be coming online. So please stay tuned. We are looking for the first and second Friday of June for these events. So definitely stay tuned to your Twitter and Instagram at Women Who Code Mobile. That's going to be coming up soon. And we are having another event this week. This will be a front end track event along with the mobile track. So this is a collaboration feature with Mike Hartington of Ionic. He's a developer advocate there. So, and we have some other great things coming up, but I just want to let you all know about that in the interim. And also, if you are interested in being a volunteer for the mobile track, definitely reach out to mobile at womenwhocode.com. We're definitely looking for more volunteers to help out with the track as well. And that's pretty much the updates that I had. Rahul, did you want to, also too, let's just check and see if we have any more questions from everyone.
So we had one that's under answered because I acknowledged it because it asked to wait till the end about how Kotlin is compiled to run on the JVM.
Okay.
You can just switch over to the answer tab and you see it, as well as the two open ones.
Okay, and I'm done with the update, so I'm gonna put it back over to Rahul for the Q&A portion.
You're muted.
Thank you, apologies. So yeah, so Mo is asking, can you tell us exactly how Kotlin is compiled to be able to run on the JVM without any modifications? This is a really good question. And honestly, I feel like I don't have that much in-depth knowledge about the particulars of the Kotlin compiler. But I know that basically Kotlin, if you have IntelliJ or Android Studio, it ships with a compiler for Kotlin, which is fully compatible with the JVM. It'll turn into bytecode. And actually there is a tool inside of IntelliJ, which you can actually see the generated bytecode from Kotlin. You can compare that to the bytecode generated by Java and see like the pros and cons of that code generation. So hopefully that will be a way for you to dive deeper and kind of explore on your own. Because honestly, I'm not an expert in that area. How would Kotlin run on the Dalvik virtual machine without hacks? This is another good question. I know that the Android team has worked really hard such that Kotlin will work back to any version of Android. or at least most versions of Android. And so whether you're using Art as the runtime system or the Dalvik runtime system on older Android devices, Kotlin should be running just the same. So I think there's a bunch of kind of Medium posts or blog posts about that. But I know the Android team has made very sure that Kotlin will be interoperable across all versions. And then I think there's 2 more questions. Is that right, Sierra? I can see
Yeah, there are 2 open ones still.
Yeah. Okay, so I feel proficient in Java for Android. Do you have a recommendation for an online Kotlin course? Yeah, I mean, I think there's a ton of educational content out there for Kotlin. I think it really depends on kind of how do you learn. Like, for example, I'm the kind of person who learns by taking a project and breaking it and then building it back up again, in the sense that I want to break something, see how it broke, and then build it again. So in that case, I would recommend just like look at some simple open source Kotlin projects, or maybe even build your own app with Kotlin. And then that'll be one good way to learn. If you are the kind of person who learns from video content or from blogs, I would recommend, there's a really good Google recommended course, I think on Udacity. So that's a really good one. If you are interested on like YouTube tutorials, I have a bunch of YouTube content out there. And if you do my stuff, of course, I'm happy to help because I have familiarity with it, right? I built it. So you can reach out to me anytime and I can help you with debugging or whatnot. But I think kind of there's a lot of good stuff out there. I just start with Google search and see what you get. And then Moses is asking, what complex bugs have you seen on Facebook portal and Kotlin? Maybe tell us a story of why it became a bug. Did it have anything to do with Kotlin language? So honestly, I mean, at my day job, I actually don't write too much Kotlin code. My day job still, because I'm more on the Android infrastructure side. And like I mentioned, right now, Kotlin on Portal is used primarily on the UI side. So my day-to-day is mostly in Java. I will say that it's not all perfect. Like I think maybe I gave folks the wrong impression that, Kotlin is like this perfect language and there's no reason not to switch. One of the downsides of Kotlin that we've seen at Facebook is that there is some build time increase, right? And if you're a developer and you have this huge code base where you have literally millions of lines of code that you need to build every time you install the app, that leads to minutes and hours and even days of productivity lost when you introduce a new language like Kotlin. I think a lot of the issues that people are facing with Kotlin at Facebook are not so much about the language having bugs or bugs as a result of Kotlin. It's more around the build system or the tooling becomes a bit more complicated because you have a new language. So hopefully that kind of answered that question.
I also noticed it makes the app heavy from Madonna in the chat window.
Yeah, heavy in what sense? Like in terms of the APK size? Let me open up the chat window.
Yes, she says yes.
Yeah, so I think definitely that's another good call out, right? Is in the sense that there are implications in you're basically Kotlin bytecode is not as efficient as Java bytecode, right? It's a higher level language, so there are implications from that perspective, and there might be some APK bloat. But typically, if you're not super concerned with like you want to shave off an extra 100 kilobytes in your app, for the most part, I think the trade-off is worth it. But again, I think if you're talking about an app like Facebook where every kilobyte or every megabyte of size matters, you do have to think about that kind of stuff. So that's a good call out too.
Do you guys have any other questions before we wrap up here? Well, I just want to thank Rahul for that really great talk, and also thank Madonna and Vivian for all their work and being involved when we were setting this up, even if they weren't in the speaking role. They were really great. They are really great mobile track leads, and I really encourage you guys to all join our Slack and stay involved in this conversation. I know I post a lot about Kotlin.
Well, thank you all. Also, thank you to Sierra, Madonna, and Vivian. Also, a special thanks to you, Rahul. Thank you for being here with us today. Such a great presentation. Also, if you all are on, please look out for a follow-up survey to come after this presentation today. We definitely want to get your feedback and see what you enjoyed about the presentation today. And please stay tuned and look out again for the Women Who Code digital events that are coming. We have several events around with our local networks in your area and around, and also with the track communities, and also with the Women Who Code Connect digital conference that is coming up. So that's all that I have today. And thank you for our sponsor. Our track sponsor is Bank of America. So special shout out and thanks to them. And we hope to see you all again online. Thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon or evening or good morning, wherever you would be located. So thank you all for attending today.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day.